At dawn, beneath a pale January sky, a snowplow idled beside a frozen creek where something unnatural interrupted the white. Patrol lights painted the banks blue as gloved hands lifted a tarp, notebooks opened, and the cold pressed silence into every breath while evidence waited to be named. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The discovery occurred outside Mill Creek Township, Pennsylvania, on the morning of January 3, 2002, after a holiday season that had ended with packed decorations and quiet roads. The victim was identified within hours as Emily Carter, 22 years old, a recent community college graduate who worked evenings at a grocery store off Route 15. Her name moved quickly from the patrol log to the county coroner's docket, then to the local paper's small front-page column, framed by snowfall totals and school closures. For men who had lived long enough to remember winters before cell phones, the scene carried a familiar gravity: cold air, patient procedure, and the slow accounting of facts. Emily Carter had been reported missing on December 29, 2001, after failing to appear for a family dinner following Christmas. Her mother filed the report at the Williamsport Barracks, bringing a photograph taken the previous Thanksgiving. Investigators noted the timing. New Year's Eve approached, resources were thin, and missing adult cases often hinged on voluntary absence. Flyers were printed anyway and tacked to bulletin boards at diners, laundromats, and the courthouse vestibule. Snow fell steadily through the last days of the year, softening tracks and sealing ground. The body's location suggested movement away from town, toward back roads known to hunters and utility crews. The creek lay near a maintenance access for a closed rail spur, a place drivers might pull over unnoticed during winter storms. No signs of disturbance were visible beyond compressed snow near the bank. A single set of tire impressions, indistinct and partially drifted, was photographed, measured, and cast. The area was canvassed methodically, with markers placed where fibers and debris were found against reeds. At autopsy, the coroner documented hypothermia as a contributing factor alongside blunt force trauma consistent with a fall or push. There was no indication of prolonged struggle. Time of death was estimated between the evening of December 28 and early December 30, narrowing the window to the heart of holiday travel. Toxicology later returned negative for alcohol and common narcotics. Fingernail scrapings yielded limited material, preserved and logged. Clothing was cataloged, dried, and sealed, including a winter coat with a missing button and a scarf bearing faint automotive grease. Police reconstructed Emily's last known movements. She clocked out at 9:17 p.m. on December 28, walking to the parking lot where her blue sedan was found the next morning, unlocked, with snow dusting the windshield. Witnesses remembered a light snowfall beginning around 9:30. A cashier recalled Emily mentioning plans to stop at a convenience store for milk. Surveillance cameras there were reviewed. The footage showed Emily entering at 9:34 p.m., exiting alone 3 minutes later, headlights from passing cars flaring across the lot. Phone records placed her mobile inactive after 9:41 p.m. Cell tower data was limited by the era, but engineers mapped the last ping along Route 15 northbound. Investigators canvassed bars and gas stations, noting holiday crowds and long hours. No confirmed sightings emerged. The case settled into winter routines. Evidence logged, leads followed, then the waiting that defines unsolved work. In January and February, detectives interviewed acquaintances, former boyfriends, coworkers, and neighbors. Emily was described consistently as cautious, punctual, and close to family. There were no debts, no history of risky behavior. A former coworker mentioned an older regular who lingered at closing time, offering rides during storms. His name was recorded, his alibi checked, and he was cleared by employment records and corroboration. Another tip pointed to a transient camp near the river. Searches found nothing. The months passed. Snow gave way to thaw and the creek rose. The evidence room stayed cold. In spring, the county prosecutor reviewed the file and urged continued effort. Media attention spiked briefly on the anniversary, then faded. For a community accustomed to quiet winters and predictable routines, the unresolved case sat like an unshoveled driveway, present and unavoidable. In late 2003, a new forensic technician audited older cases. Emily Carter's file was flagged for re-examination of trace evidence. The scarf was retested using improved methods, revealing a clearer profile of grease consistent with a specific industrial lubricant used in heavy trucking. A partial fingerprint, previously deemed insufficient, was enhanced digitally and entered into the state database. No immediate match appeared, but the data remained. Detectives revisited the tire casts. Measurements suggested a light truck or SUV with a distinctive wear pattern on the rear right tire. Registrations were cross-referenced with owners living within 20 miles who worked night shifts during the holidays. Dozens were contacted over months. Most cooperated. A few moved away. In November 2004, a tip arrived from a retired truck mechanic who recognized the lubricant description from the local paper. He named a former colleague, Robert Hale, 48 in 2002, who drove a light pickup and had been laid off that winter. Hale lived near the rail spur and had volunteered for snow removal, granting access to back roads. His name had not surfaced earlier. Investigators pulled Hale's employment records and learned he had worked late on December 28, finishing a job near the grocery store. His cell phone records showed activity along Route 15 that evening, then silence. When contacted, Hale agreed to an interview. He denied knowing Emily Carter and said he went straight home after work. He allowed a search of his garage. Nothing obvious appeared, but a box of old gloves was collected with consent. Years passed again. The case remained open, attended by different detectives as assignments changed. In 2012, Pennsylvania joined a national effort to reprocess cold cases using DNA advancements. Fingernail scrapings from Emily Carter were submitted anew. A partial male profile emerged, insufficient for CODIS but valuable. In 2019, genetic genealogy became available to law enforcement under strict guidelines. With court approval, the partial profile was uploaded to a public database. Analysts built family trees painstakingly, excluding branches. The trail narrowed to a line connected to central Pennsylvania. Robert Hale's relatives appeared within the tree, distant but consistent. A warrant was obtained for Hale's DNA. He was located in Ohio, retired, living quietly. A discarded cup provided a sample. The match probability was overwhelming. Further investigation uncovered inconsistencies in his 2002 statements and a history of boundary violations at workplaces. In 2021, Hale was arrested and extradited to Pennsylvania. Charges included criminal homicide. The trial in 2023 relied on forensic linkage, vehicle evidence, and timeline reconstruction. The jury convicted. Hale received a life sentence. The community marked closure quietly. Snow fell again. Emily Carter's name remained, finally anchored to answers. The winter after Emily Carter's death settled into routine, and investigators understood the danger of routine. Files grow quiet, calls slow, and communities adjust. Detectives kept calendars marked with reminders to revisit leads when snow returned, because weather shapes memory. They drove the same roads at the same hours, noting how headlights vanish near the rail spur and how trucks idle unseen during storms. They interviewed plow drivers and utility crews, men accustomed to night work, asking about pullouts and habits. Each interview ended the same way, with notes filed and patience demanded. Over time, persistence became their quiet discipline. By spring 2002, the Pennsylvania State Police Cold Case Unit reviewed the timeline with renewed precision. Emily Carter's final purchases were itemized, receipts logged, and clerk schedules cross-checked. Investigators learned which cameras failed during storms and which recorded grainy images worth enhancement. Phone company technicians explained limitations of towers, sectors, and handoffs common before smartphones. Those explanations narrowed travel corridors rather than pinpointing locations. Maps were annotated by hand, red lines tracing probable movement north after the convenience store stop, blue arrows showing alternative routes toward town and home. Snowmelt revealed little, but patience kept the inquiry alive locally. Summer brought heat and fewer memories, but detectives pursued vehicle evidence relentlessly. The tire impression from the creek was revisited with assistance from a regional lab that specialized in wear analysis. Measurements suggested alignment issues, producing a feathered edge, narrowing candidate vehicles. Registrations were filtered for trucks serviced locally during late 2001. Repair invoices identified customers replacing rear tires soon after the holidays. Each name generated interviews, consent searches, and comparisons. Many men were cooperative, some irritated, none charged. The process consumed months and reinforced the need for incremental certainty. Methodical persistence replaced urgency as the case aged steadily forward. Media coverage shifted from daily updates to annual remembrance, a pattern familiar to older audiences who remember print deadlines and rotary phones. The local paper ran a Thanksgiving feature on unsolved cases, placing Emily Carter's photograph beside harvest ads and weather charts. Tip lines lit briefly, then dimmed. One caller mentioned a pickup scene near the rail spur during a snowstorm. Another recalled a man offering help to stranded drivers. Each tip was logged, cross-referenced, and weighed against corroboration standards that protected the innocent and strengthened eventual prosecution. Years taught investigators endurance, restraint, and respect for procedure through time. In 2003, administrative review prompted fresh eyes. Evidence custodians verified seals, temperatures, and chain of custody, ensuring nothing compromised integrity. The scarf with automotive grease received attention as laboratories improved spectrometry. Results suggested a lubricant used in heavy-duty applications rather than household maintenance. That distinction mattered in rural Pennsylvania, where farming and trucking overlapped yet left distinct chemical signatures. Investigators compiled lists of employers, garages, and supply stores, then cross-checked purchases around December 2001. The work remained quiet, precise, and unglamorous. Such diligence appeals to men who value process, patience, and outcomes over spectacle earned through experience alone. The missing button from Emily Carter's coat became another thread. Manufacturers were contacted, and batch runs narrowed likely retailers. Sales records identified a short list of stores within driving distance. Managers from that winter remembered returns, exchanges, and storms that closed early. One recalled a customer seeking replacement buttons after a coat snagged on a truck latch. The recollection lacked certainty but added texture. Investigators noted the detail without inflating it, mindful that memory bends after holidays and years. Corroboration, not color, would decide value, and restraint remained the governing principle during every review meeting that followed through decades ahead. Thanksgiving 2003 arrived with snow flurries and another appeal. Flyers were refreshed, faces reintroduced, and timelines summarized for readers setting tables. Tips again surfaced, including a mechanic's observation about grease used in specific fleets. The information was forwarded, logged, and parked until verification could occur. Investigators avoided confirmation bias, a discipline learned over careers. They checked inventory lists and service routes, discovering which vehicles operated late near the grocery store corridor during winter storms. That approach protected credibility and ensured future charges, if any, would withstand scrutiny from defense challenges years later before judges and juries statewide, without exception ever. By 2004, a name emerged quietly from layered analysis, not accusation. Robert Hale fit several criteria: access to a pickup, night work, proximity, and familiarity with storms. Detectives documented employment records showing late shifts near the grocery store on December 28th. Cell phone billing placed him along Route 15 that night, then silent. An interview produced denials and consent searches. Gloves were collected and stored. No arrest followed. The case required more than suspicion. It demanded proof meeting Pennsylvania law. Detectives recorded limitations and waited, trusting advancements and time to assist when methods improved and courts approved their use. The years between were marked by staff changes and careful stewardship. Evidence survived moves, audits, and budget cycles. Cold rooms stayed cold. Digital backups were created. Retired officers briefed replacements, passing along nuances impossible to capture fully on paper. Community members aged, routines changed, and new businesses replaced old storefronts. Yet the rail spur remained, and snow still muffled sound there. The landscape preserved context, helping investigators imagine the night as it was experienced. Such continuity matters to audiences who appreciate procedural memory and institutional responsibility, built over decades of service within small towns and counties nationwide, quietly persisting today. In 2012, the Commonwealth authorized renewed testing using improved DNA techniques. Emily Carter's fingernail scrapings yielded a partial male profile, insufficient alone but promising. Analysts preserved it carefully, documenting alleles and confidence intervals. Prosecutors reviewed statutes and sought court permission for future methods not yet mainstream. The decision reflected caution shaped by appellate history. Investigators understood that scientific progress must align with legal acceptance to avoid jeopardizing cases built slowly over many winters. That patience defined the era and resonated with men familiar with deferred results earned through labor careers, where outcomes arrive after long waiting periods often unnoticed publicly. By 2019, genetic genealogy entered lawful practice under strict oversight. Investigators prepared affidavits, secured warrants, and partnered with accredited analysts. The partial profile was uploaded responsibly, and family trees grew branch by branch. Names were excluded carefully. When Robert Hale's lineage appeared consistent, detectives documented probabilities and sought independent corroboration. Surveillance confirmed his residence out of state. Discarded items were collected legally. A confirmatory match returned with overwhelming likelihood, converting years of suspicion into admissible certainty. The transition from possibility to proof altered the case's trajectory permanently within investigative planning meetings and prosecutorial strategy sessions, statewide thereafter, immediately following review. Arrest procedures followed established protocol. Hale was taken into custody in Ohio, advised of rights, and extradited. Pennsylvania filings detailed evidence plainly, avoiding rhetoric. Defense motions challenged timelines and methods, as expected. Courts ruled consistently, citing warrants and chain of custody. Trial preparation focused on clarity for jurors unfamiliar with technical detail. Experts explained where patterns, lubricants, and DNA probabilities. The narrative remained restrained, grounded in records, calendars, and weather reports from December 2001. Such presentation aligns with values of fairness and due process shared by older viewers who respect courts' institutions and lawful resolution without drama or hyperbole ever. In 2023, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Sentencing followed statutory guidelines, resulting in life imprisonment. The courtroom emptied quietly. No speeches were made. Emily Carter's family issued a brief statement thanking investigators and respecting process. Media coverage noted restraint. Afterward, records were archived with final notations. Detectives closed binders and logged lessons learned. Snow fell again outside the courthouse, familiar and indifferent. Closure arrived not as relief, but as resolution earned through time. Communities continued routines, informed by answers and tempered expectations about justice arriving slowly, but steadily within democratic systems they trusted over years of civic life together. The aftermath emphasized prevention and memory. The grocery store installed improved lighting, patrol schedules adjusted during storms. Community watch groups aged alongside participants, practical rather than vigilant. The rail spur was gated. None of these acts changed the past, but they acknowledged it. Emily Carter's name appeared on a small plaque at the courthouse. Each winter, someone cleared snow from it. The case became part of local history, taught quietly without spectacle. For many, that modest remembrance mattered more than headlines, and aligned with values held by generations who prefer substance over noise when reckoning with loss and truth arrives. Looking back, the Pennsylvania 2002 cold case reflected the long arc of methodical justice. Seasons framed the work, from Thanksgiving appeals to New Year snowfalls. Men who followed the story recognized the cadence of procedure, the humility of uncertainty, and the dignity of lawful resolution. Emily Carter's life was honored through accuracy rather than excess. The solved case closed quietly, leaving records complete, lessons preserved, and a community steadied by answers that arrived at last with winter. That ending suited the place, the people, and the time without fanfare but with finality earned through years of patient investigation and care. Time continued to move forward after the conviction, but understanding the full weight of the case required stepping back through the procedural layers that had carried it from winter 2002 to resolution. Investigators documented the post-trial record carefully, anticipating appeals and public records requests. Every exhibit, from tire casts to laboratory reports, was indexed and stored according to retention statutes. The discipline of documentation mattered because cold cases do not truly end when verdicts are read. They remain examples, references, and training material for future investigators who will confront similar winters, similar roads, and similar silences. For Emily Carter's case, the reconstruction of events remained the backbone. December 28, 2001, was revisited repeatedly during training briefings. Weather reports showed snowfall beginning shortly after 9 p.m., light but persistent, enough to soften sound and reduce visibility without closing roads. Traffic counts indicated fewer vehicles than normal, consistent with the lull between Christmas and New Year. Store logs confirmed reduced staffing, shorter conversations, and hurried departures. Investigators emphasized how such conditions create opportunity without spectacle, a lesson reinforced by decades of rural policing experience. The grocery store parking lot was analyzed again years later using updated modeling software. Lighting levels were mapped, shadows plotted, and camera angles recalculated. The conclusion remained unchanged. A brief interaction could occur without notice. This reinforced the original assessment that Emily Carter did not leave voluntarily, but was intercepted during a routine errand. The absence of prolonged disturbance, combined with forensic findings, supported the theory of sudden control rather than drawn-out confrontation. That distinction mattered legally and practically, shaping how evidence was weighed and how jurors later understood the sequence. Vehicle access became another instructional point. Robert Hale's pickup, ordinary and unremarkable, demonstrated how common vehicles blend into winter environments. Snow hides paint, dulls sound, and erases tracks within hours. Investigators stress that rarity is not required for concealment. Familiarity often provides better cover. This insight resonated with older audiences who know that small towns are built on repetition. The same trucks travel the same routes, and no one questions them, especially during storms when assumptions replace scrutiny. The genetic genealogy process, though decisive, was presented as supplementary rather than miraculous. Analysts explained how the partial profile alone would never have secured an arrest. Only when combined with historical records, vehicle analysis, employment logs, and opportunity did it become actionable. This reinforced a central truth. Technology accelerates conclusions but cannot replace groundwork. The case became a model for balanced integration of new tools with traditional police work, a balance valued by professionals who came of age before digital shortcuts and understand the cost of over-reliance on any single method. Appeal proceedings unfolded quietly. Defense filings challenged the admissibility of genealogical methods, citing privacy concerns and statistical interpretation. Courts responded with measured opinions, referencing warrants, consent standards, and precedent. The conviction stood. These rulings were circulated among district attorneys statewide, shaping policy and reinforcing boundaries. The case thus influenced law beyond its facts, contributing to clearer frameworks for future investigations. Such institutional impact often goes unnoticed by the public, but matters deeply to practitioners who measure success in stability and predictability rather than attention. Emily Carter's family participated minimally after sentencing. They declined interviews and asked for privacy. Investigators respected that choice, understanding that closure does not require continued exposure. Records show brief correspondence thanking departments for persistence. No public memorials were planned beyond existing markers. This restraint aligned with the family's values and the community's tone. Loss was acknowledged without ceremony, reflecting a generational preference for dignity over display, especially among those who have lived long enough to know grief rarely resolves neatly. Within the police departments involved, the case prompted internal reflection. Supervisors reviewed early assumptions about missing adults, particularly young women during holiday periods. Training materials were updated to emphasize equal urgency regardless of age or perceived lifestyle. This adjustment reflected lessons learned nationally and locally, recognizing how delay compounds difficulty when snow, time, and routine erase context. Older officers, many approaching retirement, supported these changes, seeing them as necessary evolution rather than criticism of past practice. The courthouse in Williamsport continued its routines. Calendars turned, judges rotated, and new cases filled dockets. Emily Carter's file moved from active prosecution to archived history, yet clerks remembered the trial for its clarity and restraint. There were no outbursts, no spectacle, only careful explanation and methodical presentation. For many, it reaffirmed confidence in process, a reassurance valued by citizens who have watched institutions endure through decades of social change and remain grounded in procedure. community conversations shifted subtly. During winters that followed, residents spoke more openly about safety during storms, about checking on neighbors, and about the illusion of familiarity. These were not fear-driven reactions but practical adjustments. Men who gathered at diners before dawn discussed the case in measured tones, focusing on work schedules, routes, and awareness. The story became part of local wisdom rather than cautionary folklore, reinforcing vigilance without alarm. Media retrospectives marked anniversaries with less emphasis on crime and more on resolution. Articles highlighted investigative persistence and scientific advancement rather than the act itself. This framing appealed to readers who value outcomes over intrigue. Editors understood their audience, many of whom had followed the case from the beginning and appreciated closure delivered without sensational language. The tone mirrored the investigation, deliberate, factual, and respectful. The Pennsylvania State Police incorporated the case into cold case seminars. Slides showed whether maps, evidence logs, and timelines spanning decades. Instructors emphasized patience, record-keeping, and ethical boundaries. Younger officers listened to veterans describe winters spent driving back roads, measuring impressions, and waiting for laboratories to catch up. The story bridged generations, demonstrating continuity of purpose despite changing tools. Robert Hale's incarceration proceeded without incident. Prison records show compliance and limited interaction. There were no public statements, no attempts at notoriety. His absence from the community was noted quietly, another empty driveway during snowstorms. Life continued around that absence, reinforcing how justice often removes rather than transforms. The quietness suited the nature of the crime and the community's response. Emily Carter's name appeared occasionally in educational materials about missing persons awareness. Her age, routines, and circumstances were presented factually, without embellishment. The goal was understanding, not fear. This approach reflected lessons learned over years of crime prevention efforts that succeed best when grounded in realism. Older audiences recognized this balance, having seen cycles of panic and calm repeat over lifetimes. As years passed, the case settled into the broader narrative of Pennsylvania law enforcement history. It was referenced alongside other solved cold cases, each illustrating different paths to resolution. Together, they demonstrated that time does not erase accountability, only delays it. That message resonated strongly with men who had spent careers building, repairing, and maintaining systems, with the understanding that durability matters more than speed. Winter continued to define the memory. Snowplows still idle along creeks. Patrol lights still reflect off frozen banks. Investigators still step carefully, notebooks opening in the cold. The difference now is perspective. Emily Carter's case taught that even when silence stretches for years, records speak eventually. Evidence waits. Answers arrive when method and patience converge. For those who followed the story from 2002 onward, the resolution reaffirmed a belief shaped by experience rather than optimism. Justice is not dramatic. It is slow, procedural, and often unsatisfying in its simplicity. Yet it endures. The Pennsylvania 2002 cold case became proof that persistence matters, that institutions can learn, and that quiet winters can still yield truth when someone continues to look, measure, and remember. That understanding carried forward into subsequent seasons. Thanksgiving dinners passed with fewer unanswered questions. New Year's mornings arrived without unresolved headlines. Snow still fell, covering roads and fields, but beneath it lay records complete and answers secured. Emily Carter's story ended not with noise, but with certainty, and that certainty became part of the landscape, as permanent as the rail spur, the courthouse files, and the disciplined work that finally connected them across time. The final phase of understanding the case unfolded after the legal process concluded, when investigators and historians alike examined how a seemingly ordinary winter disappearance became a decades-long pursuit of accountability. Emily Carter's death was not defined by spectacle or chaos, but by the quiet convergence of circumstance, access, and seasonal isolation. That reality framed every retrospective analysis conducted by state police units, reviewing cold cases across Pennsylvania, especially those rooted in rural corridors where weather and familiarity obscure risk. The geography surrounding Mill Creek Township received renewed attention in these evaluations. Maps highlighted how the creek, rail spur, and service roads formed a transitional zone between town and countryside. Such spaces often evade constant observation, particularly during winter when travel slows and routines shrink inward. Investigators noted that crimes occurring in these margins rely less on force than opportunity. Emily Carter's final errand placed her briefly within such a margin, illustrating how vulnerability can emerge from routine rather than deviation. Records showed that Robert Hale's movements that night aligned with this pattern. His work schedule, vehicle access, and proximity to secondary roads created a narrow window that only became visible when layered over years of data. Analysts emphasized that no single element proved decisive. Instead, the alignment of small, lawful facts built a structure strong enough to support conviction. This approach reinforced a central lesson: cases endure when built patiently, not aggressively. Weather analysis remained a recurring theme in after-action reports. Snowfall intensity, temperature, and wind direction were revisited using archived meteorological data. These factors explained why sound traveled poorly, why tire impressions softened quickly, and why witnesses remembered little beyond the storm itself. Older investigators recognized this instinctively, having worked countless winters where snow erased more than tracks. Formalizing that understanding helped younger officers appreciate environmental context as evidence rather than background. Community response over time also became part of the record. Initial fear gave way to quiet vigilance, then to reflection. Town meetings addressed lighting, patrol visibility, and support for families of missing adults. None of these measures were reactionary. They reflected a measured response shaped by experience, aligning with a culture that values steady improvement over dramatic change. Emily Carter's case influenced these discussions without dominating them, serving as reference rather than rallying cry. Educational institutions incorporated the case into criminology curricula, focusing on procedural integrity. Students examine how evidence was preserved across decades, how warrants were secured for emerging technologies, and how interagency cooperation remained consistent despite personnel turnover. These lessons highlighted institutional memory as a form of evidence itself, one that sustains investigations long after initial momentum fades. The role of local media received similar scrutiny. Editors and reporters reviewed coverage decisions, acknowledging early limitations and later restraint. The shift from active reporting to anniversary remembrance mirrored best practices for unresolved cases, balancing public awareness with respect for families. By the time resolution arrived, coverage emphasized process and outcome rather than shock, reflecting maturity in both journalism and audience expectations. Emily Carter's personal history was treated carefully in retrospectives. Records confirmed her steady employment, educational goals, and family connections. There were no hidden conflicts, no unexplored lifestyles, no narrative shortcuts. This clarity prevented misdirection and underscored the importance of resisting assumptions about victims. Investigators noted that such restraint protected the case from early distortion, preserving focus on evidence rather than speculation. The judicial record further reinforced procedural discipline. Transcripts showed consistent rulings grounded in precedent, particularly regarding the admissibility of genealogical evidence. Judges articulated boundaries clearly, ensuring that innovation did not outpace rights. These decisions contributed to statewide guidelines, shaping how future cases would balance investigative reach with constitutional protection. Correctional records following Hale's sentencing revealed no extraordinary developments. His incarceration followed standard classification, with no public correspondence or media engagement. This absence of spectacle reinforced the case's defining characteristic: resolution without drama. Justice occurred through documentation, review, and lawful determination rather than confession or confrontation. Emily Carter's family maintained privacy throughout these later years. Their limited engagement reflected a desire for normalcy rather than advocacy. Investigators respected this stance, understanding that closure does not require continued participation. Internal notes emphasize gratitude for cooperation without expectation, a reminder that families bear burdens long after files close. Within law enforcement, the case influenced mentoring practices. Senior officers used it to illustrate patience, warning against premature conclusions, and emphasizing the value of preserving evidence meticulously. Younger detectives learned that success often appears incremental until it suddenly becomes definitive. This lesson resonated strongly among professionals who entered service expecting immediacy but learned endurance. Seasonal markers continued to shape memory. Thanksgiving reminders, New Year reflections, and winter patrols kept the case present even after resolution. These rhythms mirrored the investigation's cadence, reinforcing how time frames perception and persistence. For many officers, Emily Carter's case became synonymous with winter work, a reminder that cold environments demand warm discipline. Policy discussions followed, addressing missing adult protocols and interagency databases. Adjustments ensured earlier coordination and clearer thresholds for escalation. These changes did not assign blame but acknowledged evolution. Older administrators recognized parallels with earlier reforms, viewing progress as cumulative rather than corrective. The physical landscape also changed subtly. The rail spur area saw restricted access, signage, and maintenance adjustments. These measures were practical, not symbolic, aimed at reducing isolation during storms. Community members accepted them as sensible improvements, reflecting a shared understanding shaped by years of reflection. As the case entered historical archives, it joined others solved through persistence rather than luck. Analysts compared timelines, noting how advancements often arrive just in time for preserved evidence. Emily Carter's file demonstrated that readiness matters as much as discovery. Without careful storage and documentation, later breakthroughs would have meant little. The broader cultural impact remained understated. There were no documentaries produced locally, no tour or exhibits. Instead, the story lived in training rooms, court opinions, and quiet conversations among residents. This understated legacy aligned with community values and the preferences of those who witnessed the case unfold slowly over years. Ultimately, the Pennsylvania 2002 cold case illustrated a fundamental truth about justice in familiar places. It arrives not through noise but through continuity. It depends on records kept, procedures followed, and people willing to return to the same questions each winter. Emily Carter's story concluded with certainty earned through restraint, and that certainty became part of the town's fabric, steady and unspoken, like snow settling after a long night. Winter returned to Mill Creek Township in the years after the case was finally resolved, and with it came a quieter understanding of what had been accomplished. The snowplows followed the same routes, courthouse lights came on before dawn, and men who had watched the story unfold over 2 decades understood that the conclusion was not an ending but a settling. Emily Carter's case became part of the town's internal record, referenced not aloud but remembered in the way people measured time and responsibility. Investigators who had worked the file reflected on the discipline required to carry it forward. From the beginning, the case demanded restraint. There were no dramatic witnesses, no confessions, no sudden turns. Instead, there were forms filled carefully, evidence sealed against moisture, and interviews conducted without pressure. That approach preserved the integrity of the work long enough for science and law to meet it. In that sense, the resolution belonged as much to patience as to proof. The final review of records emphasized how early decisions shaped the outcome decades later. Evidence that might once have seemed marginal was preserved properly, allowing retesting under improved standards. Notes that appeared routine provided context when memories faded. Whether logs and traffic counts, mundane at the time, later anchored timelines. This accumulation of ordinary detail ultimately carried extraordinary weight, reinforcing a lesson known to experienced professionals. Thoroughness outlasts urgency. Emily Carter's name remained present in training environments rather than public spaces. New investigators learned her story as an example of continuity, of how cases persist beyond personnel changes and shifting priorities. The emphasis was always on method, not emotion. That framing honored the victim by avoiding speculation and respecting the boundaries of what could be proven. It also reflected a generational preference for facts over flourish, especially among those who have lived long enough to see systems tested and improved. The legal outcome stood without complication. Appeals were exhausted, rulings upheld, and the sentence carried out according to statute. There were no surprises, no reversals, no lingering uncertainty. This finality mattered deeply to a community accustomed to closure defined by certainty rather than drama. Justice arrived without spectacle, fitting the character of the place, and the people who followed the case patiently for years. In the quiet aftermath, small changes endured. Patrol practices during winter storms remained cautious. Store owners maintained lighting and visibility. Families checked in more consistently during holidays. These were not reactions born of fear, but habits shaped by awareness. They reflected a practical response to understanding how ordinary routines can intersect with risk, especially when weather and isolation converge. Emily Carter's family continued their lives away from public attention. Their grief was not a narrative device but a constant reality, respected by investigators and neighbors alike. Closure did not erase loss, but it replaced uncertainty with truth. That distinction mattered, particularly to those who understand that answers, even difficult ones, provide a foundation for endurance. The broader significance of the case extended beyond county lines. It demonstrated how cold cases can be solved lawfully when institutions commit to preservation and ethical advancement. The use of genetic genealogy was carefully bounded, supported by warrants and oversight, and integrated into a larger evidentiary framework. This balance reassured skeptics and set standards for future work, reinforcing trust in systems that evolve without abandoning principle. For older men who followed the story, the case resonated because it mirrored their own experiences with long-term effort. Many had spent careers building projects that took years to complete, maintaining machines through seasons, or serving communities where results emerged slowly. Emily Carter's case reflected that rhythm. It was not solved by chance, but by steady accumulation and refusal to abandon responsibility. The physical places connected to the investigation remained unchanged in many ways. The creek still froze in winter. The rail spur still marked a boundary between town and field. The courthouse still opened early, its files kept cool and orderly. These constants grounded the story in reality, reminding observers that crimes occur in familiar settings and are resolved through familiar means when attention persists. As time passed, the case receded from daily conversation but not from institutional memory. It became one of many examples used to illustrate why evidence is never discarded lightly and why documentation matters. Younger officers learned that they may not be present for the resolution of every case they begin, but their work still carries forward. That understanding reinforced a sense of shared duty across generations. Seasonal markers continued to frame reflection. Each Thanksgiving brought quieter gratitude for answers. Each new year underscored the passage of time and the endurance of effort. Winter storms no longer carried unresolved questions tied to Emily Carter's disappearance, but they still reminded residents of the conditions that shaped the investigation. Memory and environment remained linked, even after closure. The solved case also influenced how missing adults were treated locally. Assumptions were challenged, and protocols adjusted to ensure earlier coordination and review. These changes did not rewrite the past, but they strengthened future responses. Such incremental improvement reflected a mature understanding of progress, one built on lessons rather than blame. Ultimately, the Pennsylvania 2002 cold case stood as a testament to measured justice. It showed that truth can remain intact beneath years of snow if protected carefully. It showed that restraint can be as powerful as action, and that lawful persistence yields results even when timelines stretch beyond expectation. Emily Carter's story concluded not with spectacle, but with certainty, earned through patience, accuracy, and respect for process. That certainty became part of the community's quiet confidence. It affirmed that even in small towns with limited resources and long winters, accountability is possible. It reinforced faith in records kept, procedures followed, and people who returned to unanswered questions year after year. In the end, the case resolved as it was lived, within ordinary routines and familiar seasons, leaving behind a completed record and a community steadied by truth that finally arrived.